Savannah, Georgia, USA. 2018. Savannah, an ancient city with a centuries-old history, was nestled in the heart of Georgia. The city was a harmonious blend of Southern hospitality and old-world charm, making it truly unique. Spring was the most pleasant season in Savannah. The weather was warm but not yet hot, and the fresh air was filled with the scents of blooming magnolias and jasmine. On this day, the sun gently illuminated the wide paths of Forsyth Park, the city's crown jewel. The shadows of ancient oaks draped in Spanish moss stretched across the manicured walkways, creating a tranquil atmosphere. James and Emily Hunt strolled leisurely down the park's main avenue, enjoying their rare weekend off. For James, Sunday morning walks were not just a habit, but a necessary respite from business meetings, shipments, and constant client interactions. At 38, he had achieved what he had aspired to since his youth: success. His high-end clothing store, located in downtown Savannah, was a favorite among the city's affluent residents. The store, Hunt and Partners, offered premium clothing and accessories, with James personally curating the inventory, engaging with customers, and overseeing every detail of the business. It was his pride and a testament to the belief that hard work could lead to success. James looked impeccable. His tall stature, strong build, and confident posture immediately drew attention. Today he wore a dark navy blazer that accentuated his fit physique, paired with a light gray shirt. A silver watch gleamed on his wrist, and a folded handkerchief peeked from his blazer pocket. His hair was always neatly styled, and his clean-shaven face lent him the appearance of a respectable businessman. But it was his gaze that stood out most. Though calm, James's eyes were always watchful and discerning. It seemed he could assess a person in an instant and draw his conclusions. Emily was the complete opposite of her husband. Her light, almost porcelain skin and soft facial features contrasted with James's appearance. She looked elegant but without excessive formality. Today, Emily wore a light blue dress with a delicate floral pattern that complemented her understated makeup. Her always well-groomed, smooth hair was gathered in a low bun, and a thin silver bracelet, a gift from James on their 5th wedding anniversary, adorned her wrist. Working as a preschool teacher at Sunshine Academy was not just a job for Emily. It was her calling. Her love for children, patience, and sincerity made her one of the most respected staff members at the preschool. Parents often left her thank you notes, and children affectionately called her Miss Emmy. Emily always made sure that every detail of her appearance conveyed warmth and kindness, whether it was a simple dress or the faint, barely noticeable scent of vanilla in her perfume. Their walk through the park was quiet and measured. Holding Emily's hand, James told her about a recent success, signing a contract with a major supplier of designer suits. Emily, in turn, shared a story about one of the children in her group who had drawn her a picture depicting the sun, flowers, and a smiling teacher. She laughed as she recalled how the child had declared the sun in the drawing looked magical. Their happiness seemed genuine. James was proud of his wife and her unwavering kindness, brightness, and dedication. Emily, in turn, adored him for his reliability and his drive to protect and support her. They continued walking, stopping at the fountain to admire how the sunlight played on the water. Their images, the successful businessman and the caring preschool teacher, perfectly complemented each other. But at that moment, they were being watched. In the shadow of one of the oaks near the main avenue stood a woman. She did not stand out in the crowd, but her gaze was fixed solely on Emily. This was Sophie Miller, a 36-year-old private investigator known for her ability to uncover the truth, no matter how unpleasant it might be. Sophie was dressed in a strict gray pantsuit, paired with a white blouse that revealed a graceful neckline. Her dark hair was tied back in a ponytail, and a leather bag slung over her shoulder held a notebook and a small camera. She stood motionless, intently observing the couple, her face remaining expressionless. Emily seemed familiar to her. It took Sophie only a few moments to remember. This was her old friend from years ago. The memories came flooding back, sharp and painful. Sophie recalled how they had studied together in college, sharing secrets and making plans for the future. But what stood out most was what Emily had been like back then. Her wild youth, numerous relationships, and careless attitude toward commitments. Sophie knew too much about this woman's past. Seeing Emily now in such a flawless guise, Sophie felt a mix of emotions: surprise, irritation, but most of all, suspicion. She didn't believe people could change so drastically. She continued watching them until they disappeared around the corner. Emily was laughing, looking at James, and he, seemingly mesmerized, responded in kind. To Sophie, the scene was too perfect to be true. She couldn't shake the thought that James knew nothing about his wife's past. And if that were the case, he deserved to know. When the couple left, Sophie remained where she was. Her mind was racing. She didn't intend to interfere in someone else's life, but her professional instincts wouldn't let her walk away. Sophie believed that the truth should always come to light, no matter how unpleasant its consequences. She pulled out her notebook, jotted down a few notes, and only then left the park. Several days had passed since James and Emily Hunt had enjoyed their Sunday stroll through Forsyth Park. Time moved at its usual pace, and their lives continued in the same steady rhythm. James fully immersed himself in managing his store, while Emily remained dedicated to her work with children at the preschool. Their home on a quiet street, surrounded by a neat garden, appeared as serene as ever. But this harmony was soon disrupted. One evening, Emily stayed late at work. She had informed James in advance that she would be staying to prepare materials for the next day's lessons. This was nothing unusual for her. The children required a lot of time and effort, and she often took on additional responsibilities. James spent the evening at home, calmly sorting through documents that needed his signature for an upcoming shipment of designer suits. It was already 9 o'clock when an unexpected knock came at the door. This was unusual. They rarely had visitors, especially at such a late hour. James rose from his desk, walked through the living room, and opened the door. Standing on the porch was a woman. She was dressed in the same sharp gray suit she had worn the day they had crossed paths in the park, and the same leather bag hung over her shoulder. Her face was composed, but her eyes held a keen intensity. It was Sophie Miller. She introduced herself politely, stating her name and mentioning that she was an old friend of Emily's. Her voice was low and steady, devoid of unnecessary emotion. But what she said next made James frown. Sophie revealed that she was a private investigator and suggested they have a conversation about his wife. James tensed, but invited her inside. After all, she seemed to know Emily, and he saw no reason to refuse. Sophie entered the living room and carefully sat on the couch. She exuded confidence, the air of someone accustomed to difficult conversations. James took a seat across from her and waited. Sophie began her story. She spoke of her past friendship with Emily, emphasizing that they had once been close, but then her tone shifted. She began to talk about knowing a very different Emily, one who frequently changed partners and led a chaotic personal life. Sophie tactfully but clearly hinted that perhaps Emily hadn't entirely left her old ways behind. James listened silently. Memories of his years with Emily flashed through his mind. She had always seemed loyal, sincere, and devoted. Never once during their marriage had he noticed anything suspicious. But Sophie's words carried conviction. They planted the first seeds of doubt in his mind. Sophie offered her services as a detective. She could investigate and find out if Emily was hiding something from him. But James declined. He trusted his wife and saw no reason to take such steps. Sophie didn't push the issue. She simply pulled a business card from her bag, handed it to James, and said that if he ever needed her help, he could contact her. After Sophie left, James was left alone. He placed the card on the coffee table, intending to forget about the conversation. But the thoughts Sophie had planted were already taking root in his mind. He tried to dismiss them, but the doubts steadily grew. The following weeks were difficult. James tried not to show his unease, but deep down, he couldn't shake his suspicions. Emily continued her work, coming home as usual with a smile and gently asking about his day. But now every gesture, Every glance seemed suspicious to James. He began to notice small details he had previously overlooked. One evening, Emily came home with a bouquet of flowers. She happily explained that the flowers were a gift from the parents of one of her preschool students as a token of appreciation for her work. The bouquet sat on the table, vibrant and fresh, but James caught a faint scent of men's cologne on Emily. He noticed it, but said nothing. He simply nodded curtly, trying to conceal his unease. With each passing day, his doubts grew stronger. Emily often stayed late at work, sometimes returning home late at night, explaining her absences as meetings with friends. She continued to act as if nothing had changed, but James felt a fracture in their lives. Finally, the breaking point came. One evening, Emily didn't come home at all. James waited for her until midnight, then until 2 in the morning, but she never appeared. He began calling her, but her phone was off. Only in the early hours of the morning did Emily finally return. She looked tired, but acted as though nothing had happened. She claimed that after work, she had gone to a club with friends and had simply forgotten to let him know. Those words were the last straw. James could no longer tolerate it. His doubts had turned into certainty. He could no longer ignore the peculiarities in his wife's behavior or her nocturnal absences. He needed to know the truth, and now he knew who could help him. James picked up Sophie's business card from the coffee table and dialed her number. Within minutes, Sophie answered with her calm, confident voice. She agreed to meet him that evening. Now James was ready for the truth, no matter how bitter it might be. After James's call, Sophie Miller arrived at their home that same evening. She looked as composed as ever, a sharp gray suit, neatly styled hair, and a calm professionalism in her every movement. She entered the living room and took a moment to scan the room before sitting across from James at the small coffee table. The house itself hadn't changed since her first visit, but the atmosphere was entirely different. This time the air was thick with tension and hidden anger. James looked exhausted. His typically steady and confident demeanor had been replaced with wariness. A brief argument with Emily the previous night, coupled with her refusal to explain herself, had left him unsettled. He no longer knew what to believe, and that uncertainty had pushed him to take this step. He needed to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Sophie listened silently, noting every detail of his account. She jotted down quick notes in her notebook, capturing key moments that could be pivotal. James described Emily's recent changes in behavior, her frequent late nights, unexplained outings, unexpected gifts, and the faint scent of men's cologne. His tone was even, but beneath it lay hurt and disappointment. When James finished, Sophie paused for a moment, studying his expression, then nodded. She offered to begin the investigation immediately if he was ready. This time, James didn't hesitate. He was certain that knowing the truth, no matter how bitter, was more important than living in doubt. The next day, Sophie began her work. Her first step was tracking Emily's routines. Sophie spent the day near the preschool, observing how Emily spent her time at work. She recorded the exact times Emily arrived and left, noting her interactions with parents and colleagues. Emily appeared fully dedicated to her job. She took children on walks, engaged with parents, and seemed to enjoy their trust. However, Emily's behavior shifted dramatically after work. Instead of heading home as one might expect, she made her way toward the city center. Sophie followed her from a distance. Outwardly, Emily appeared the same. A modest dress, neat hairstyle, and a light step. But as she turned down a quiet alley, her demeanor changed. Emily walked with confidence, as if she knew exactly where she was going and what awaited her. A few minutes later, she entered a small but popular nightclub near Savannah's Central Square. The venue was known for its lively parties and an atmosphere that attracted a younger crowd. Sophie stayed outside, keeping watch on the entrance. She noted that Emily had arrived alone, but inside the club she seemed to lead an entirely different life. An hour later, Emily exited the club, but she wasn't alone. A tall man, dressed in an expensive shirt and jeans, accompanied her. They laughed together, their behavior leaving little doubt about their intentions. Sophie trailed them discreetly. The pair made their way to a small hotel tucked away on a quiet street. The next day, Sophie resumed her surveillance. The scenario repeated itself. After work, Emily headed to the same club, but this time she left with a different man. Sophie documented everything with her camera: photographs, videos, times, and locations. She compiled evidence that left no room for doubt. When Sophie returned to James a few days later, her briefcase was filled with evidence. She laid out the photographs before him: Emily leaving the club, Emily with the men, Emily entering the hotel. She played videos showing his wife flirting and behaving intimately with complete strangers. Sophie had no intention of destroying their family, but her job required her to reveal the full truth. James sat in silence. His face had turned pale, and his gaze was fixed on the photographs. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. It felt as though his perfect life had crumbled in an instant. Every moment they had shared now seemed like a lie. His Emily, his loyal and loving wife, was not who he thought she was. Sophie continued to speak in her measured tone, presenting the facts she had gathered. She offered no judgments or conclusions, only the evidence. When she finished, she suggested that James keep the materials, in case he needed them in the future. James thanked her, but his voice was cold, almost mechanical. After Sophie left, James was left alone in the living room. The photographs lay on the table in front of him, and he looked at them again and again. A storm of anger brewed inside him. He couldn't fathom how the person he trusted most in the world could betray him like this. That night was a sleepless one. For the first time in years, James felt his entire world collapsing around him. The days following James's conversation with Sophie turned into a nightmare for him. His mind was consumed with conflicting emotions: anger, resentment, and humiliation. He couldn't shake the images from those photographs, which now seemed to hold his entire life captive. They lay hidden in an envelope in his study. But every time he entered the room, it felt as though the envelope pulled his gaze like a magnet. Emily suspected nothing. She continued her routine as if nothing had changed. Her late nights at work, the scent of unfamiliar cologne, the bouquets of flowers, and even her occasional smiles increasingly filled James with disgust. He tried to mask his emotions, but beneath his composed exterior was a brewing storm, ready to erupt at any moment. One evening, when Emily stayed late at work again, James sat alone in the quiet living room, lost in thought. His eyes fell on a photograph on the shelf, their wedding photo. Emily was smiling, her arms around his shoulders, and he looked so happy and confident. That moment felt like it belonged to another life. Now, he felt like an entirely different man. The thought haunted him. If he hadn't agreed to Sophie's help, he might have continued living in blissful ignorance. Perhaps that would have been better, but the thought was quickly replaced by rage. How could she do this? How could she betray me? He repeated to himself over and over. The next day, James decided to take matters into his own hands. He no longer wanted to feel like a victim. He knew the truth was on his side, and now he needed to decide what to do next. He called Sophie and asked to meet. They arranged to meet at a cafe on Broughton Street, just a few blocks from his home. It was a quiet place where they wouldn't be overheard. When James arrived, Sophie was already waiting. She sat at a corner table by the window with a cup of coffee in front of her and her notebook open to the middle. Her professional demeanor and calm presence reassured him. He felt he could trust her, even though her work had shattered the illusion of his perfect life. Sophie listened attentively. James explained that he could no longer pretend nothing was happening. He said he felt trapped between two worlds, one where he believed his wife was loyal, and another, the reality revealed by the photographs. His voice was tense, but he tried to speak clearly and without emotion. Sophie, without interrupting, offered him options. She explained that he had the right to use the evidence for a divorce or legal action. She also mentioned that she could assist with further investigations if needed. But she noticed something in James's tone beyond the desire to expose Emily, a deeper personal wound that demanded closure. The conversation in the cafe lasted over an hour. James spoke about his sleepless nights and how he felt his life was now divided into before and after. Sophie listened, then suggested that he take a pause to carefully consider his next steps. She reminded him that revenge, no matter how sweet it might seem, could have consequences. But James wasn't listening to her warnings. An idea was already forming in his mind, one that he believed could finally put an end to his suffering. In the days that followed, James meticulously planned his actions. Emily, oblivious to his suspicions, continued behaving as if everything was normal. Her frequent absences, the scent of cologne, excuses about work, and meetings with friends were, to James, undeniable proof that she was leading a double life. But now, he knew he wouldn't remain a silent observer. He began searching for someone who could help him. James understood that to carry out his plan, he needed a professional, someone who wouldn't ask questions and who could get the job done quickly and discreetly. Through his business connections, he found the person he was looking for. The contact was passed to him through intermediaries, and the meeting was arranged at an unassuming bar on the outskirts of the city. The man who sat across from James in the dimly lit booth was exactly what he had expected, a short, stocky man with his face partially hidden under the brim of a cap. His voice was low and gravelly, and his manner of speaking was brief and businesslike. The man didn't ask unnecessary questions. He listened as James, doing his best to hide his nerves, laid out his request, nodding occasionally to show he understood every detail. James explained his requirements clearly and without emotion. He wanted the job done quickly, quietly, and without leaving any trace. The man nodded and named a price, a sum so high it even gave James pause. But James agreed. For him, this wasn't just about solving a problem, it was about reclaiming control over his life. After the meeting, James returned home. Emily, as usual, was at work with the children, and the house was empty. He went to his study, took out the envelope with the photographs, and looked through them again. His expression was cold, almost mechanical. He knew there was no turning back. That day marked the beginning of his path to revenge. Everything that had come before, the doubts, the hurt, the disappointment, had now crystallized into a clear plan. James couldn't forgive Emily for her lies. He felt that only drastic action could restore justice. The evening that would mark the beginning of the end for Emily Hunt had arrived. James, as usual, stayed home, pretending his day was no different from any other. He sat at his desk, shuffling through documents and maintaining a facade of calm. But his thoughts were far from business. He knew that tonight, his meticulously planned operation would begin. Over the past few days, he had replayed every detail in his mind. His decision was cold and calculated. James didn't just want to get rid of Emily. He wanted to do it in such a way that no one would ever trace her disappearance back to him. The hitman he had hired was swift and professional. This was a man without a name, without a past, without attachments, but with an experience that spoke for itself. Their first meeting had left James with an odd impression. The man looked unremarkable, yet exuded a chilling confidence. He asked minimal questions and noted only the details relevant to Emily, her usual routes, favorite places, and work schedule. James provided the information with precision, down to the minute. Meanwhile, Emily continued her life, completely unaware that she was being watched. She left for work in the morning, smiling at the children and receiving gratitude from parents. But her evenings remained a mystery to most, except those now lurking in the shadows, tracking her every move. That evening, around 7 p.m., Emily returned home briefly. She changed into a light pastel dress, added a touch of makeup, and told James she was meeting some friends. He nodded without looking up from his papers. His voice betrayed no suspicion. Everything seemed as though he accepted her words at face value. When the door closed behind Emily, James rose slowly from his desk and looked out the window. He watched her get into her car and drive away, as though nothing unusual was happening. His gaze remained cold, as if he were observing a stranger rather than his wife. The hitman was already in position. He had been following Emily for days and knew her routine by heart. As soon as she parked her car near her favorite club, he began to move. Dressed to blend in, dark jeans, a black t-shirt, and a baseball cap, He kept his face in the shadows and his movements confident and deliberate. Emily spent about 2 hours in the club. She laughed, flirted, and chatted with men before leaving with a new companion. This time, it was a tall man with a thick beard, wearing an expensive leather jacket. They walked together toward her car, parked several blocks from the club. The hitman maintained a safe distance, remaining unseen. When the pair reached her car, the man bid Emily goodbye and walked away. Emily was left alone. She opened her bag to retrieve her keys, and at that moment, the hitman approached. He moved quickly and silently. Emily noticed him only at the last second, but there was no time to react. The cold glint of a knife under the dim streetlight was the last thing she saw. The hitman struck with precision, delivering several quick blows that left her body collapsing onto the pavement. It was over in seconds. He left no traces, disappearing swiftly into the shadows of the surrounding buildings. Emily lay motionless on the ground, her light dress soaked in blood, while the world around her remained a silent witness to her final moments. At home, James waited, wide awake. He didn't call, didn't text, and didn't try to find out where his wife was. He knew the answers would come soon enough. When the clock struck midnight, he walked into the living room, poured himself a glass of whiskey, and sat on the couch. His gaze was fixed on nothingness. He felt no satisfaction, no relief. Inside, there was only emptiness. The next day, the city went about its usual routine. People rushed to work, children ran to school, and no one knew what had happened the night before. Only James knew that his world had changed. For the first time in a long while, he felt he had regained control over his life. But with it came an unexpected sense of loneliness. Emily's body was never found. The hitman, as promised, had done his job flawlessly. No traces, no evidence, no questions. Emily Hunt had vanished without a trace, and her absence became, for James, a long-awaited release from the lies that had been eating away at him. The days following Emily Hunt's disappearance dragged on slowly, as if the world around James had lost its usual rhythm. The early mornings in his house were unnervingly quiet. No longer did the scent of freshly brewed coffee wake him, nor did Emily's presence flit through the cozy kitchen as she put the finishing touches on breakfast. The home, once filled with her warmth and vitality, now felt cold and empty. James woke up early, but his mornings no longer started with a smile. He sat at the kitchen table, holding a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. His gaze was fixed on the neat yard outside, a space Emily had loved to decorate with flowers. Now that garden was just another reminder of what was no longer there. Meanwhile, rumors began to spread through the city. Emily's disappearance came as a shock to everyone who knew her. Her colleagues at the preschool were the first to sound the alarm when she failed to show up for work. Parents who had grown accustomed to her kindness and care asked where she had gone, but no one had any answers. The police received a missing person report, but their investigation yielded no leads. James acted as though he was just as shocked as everyone else. When detectives came to his home, he answered their questions with composure. He explained that Emily had left the house on an ordinary evening, saying she was meeting friends, and never returned. He mentioned that her disappearance was strange, but suggested that perhaps she had stayed overnight at a friend's house. The detectives asked about her habits and whether there had been any issues in their marriage, but James confidently stated that he had noticed nothing unusual. His words sounded convincing, and the lack of direct evidence or witnesses led the police to follow standard protocol, questioning neighbors, reviewing surveillance footage, and filing reports. Sophie Miller, meanwhile, kept a close eye on the situation. She knew more than the police, but she chose to remain in the shadows. Her professional experience told her that in cases like this, the key was to be patient and avoid drawing unnecessary attention. She continued to monitor James, occasionally visiting his store under the guise of being a customer. James, for his part, maintained an air of cold composure. He knew that nothing connected him to Emily's disappearance. The hitman he had hired had done his job flawlessly. The body was gone. No traces were left. Yet at the same time, new feelings began to stir within him. Each day, he woke up with a sense of relief, but alongside it came an odd emptiness. Memories of Emily, which had once caused him pain and anger, now felt like distant echoes. He no longer thought about her betrayal, but sometimes he caught himself remembering her laughter or the softness in her eyes. Around the city, James felt the weight of people's gazes. Perhaps it was only his imagination, but he noticed how neighbors, colleagues, and even strangers seemed to look at him. Some appeared sympathetic, others suspicious. But James continued to play his role. He was the grieving husband who had lost his wife, a role he played to perfection. The police, meanwhile, began reviewing surveillance footage. The cameras had captured Emily entering the club on the night of her disappearance, but there were no traces of her afterward. No cameras recorded her path to the hotel, and no witnesses reported seeing her leave the club. James knew this was a waiting game, and eventually the police would close the case due to lack of progress. One evening, Sophie paid James another visit. She knew their meeting carried risks, but wanted to gauge his state of mind. They sat in the living room, where everything reminded her of their first conversation, when she had shown him the photos of Emily. Now it felt as though everything had changed. James spoke calmly, but Sophie sensed his tension. She asked simple questions, hinting that perhaps the full truth had not yet come to light, but James remained composed. His answers were precise, and his expression betrayed no emotion. After Sophie left, James pondered her motives. He suspected that she might know more than she was letting on. Her questions were too direct, too calculated, but he also understood that Sophie wouldn't act without solid evidence. That night, James sat in the darkness of his study for hours, reflecting on what his decision had brought him. His life had become quieter, more orderly, but with it came an overwhelming sense of loneliness he couldn't escape. He knew there was no turning back. All he could do now was move forward, keeping the truth buried, a secret that he intended to carry to his grave. Several weeks had passed since Emily's disappearance. The city continued its steady rhythm, but for James Hunt, everything had changed. He returned to work, trying to fill his days with client meetings, negotiations, and planning. His store remained successful, but James felt no joy in it anymore. What once gave his life meaning now seemed like nothing more than mechanical repetition. The case of Emily's disappearance gradually faded from attention. The police officially announced that they had no new leads and shifted their focus to other investigations. Neighbors and friends, who had initially been actively curious about Emily's fate, began to move on. This gave James a measure of relief, yet with each passing day, the silence around the case felt more unsettling than the investigation itself. Sophie Miller hadn't disappeared from his life. She occasionally called him, suggested meeting, and sometimes dropped by his store. Her visits were unobtrusive, but each one kept James on edge. She never mentioned Emily directly, but her tone and the way she looked at him suggested she was still thinking about the case. One evening, Sophie invited him to dinner at a small restaurant near Savannah's waterfront. The proposal was unexpected, but James agreed. He realized their interactions had evolved into something more than just professional exchanges. Sophie had been the one to shatter his illusions. Yet she was also the only person who truly knew what he had been through. This strange mix of trust and danger gave their connection an almost intimate quality. The restaurant was quiet, illuminated by soft candlelight and accompanied by gentle music. Sophie looked elegant yet understated. She wore a simple black dress, her hair loose, and her makeup barely noticeable. James couldn't help but notice how different she seemed. There was none of the cold professionalism she usually carried when visiting his home or store. They spoke about everything except Emily. Sophie shared stories about her recent investigations and how her life had changed over the years. James listened intently, occasionally asking questions, but mostly remaining silent. He felt this dinner was a strange turning point in their relationship, though he wasn't sure where it would lead. As the dinner came to an end, Sophie made an unexpected gesture. She gently touched his hand. The moment lasted only a few seconds, but James felt his inner tension ease slightly. Her gaze was serious, yet it held something more than professional interest. After dinner they walked along the waterfront, lit by street lamps. The water lapped softly against the piers, and a cool breeze carried a sense of calm. James felt drawn to Sophie, but doubts lingered in his mind. She was the person who had destroyed his past life, yet now she seemed to be the only one who could understand his present. Their relationship began to develop slowly but steadily. Sophie started visiting his store more often, suggesting dinners or simple walks together. She never asked about what had happened to Emily, but her silent presence spoke volumes. James felt he could find a new sense of purpose and stability in her company. Yet, a shadow of the past remained within him. He knew their relationship was built on a secret that could never be revealed. Each time they were together, he wondered, did Sophie know more than she let on? Did she suspect his involvement in Emily's disappearance went deeper than it seemed? But she never asked direct questions, and James decided not to torment himself with speculation. One evening, as they sat at his home over a glass of wine, Sophie said, "Sometimes the truth is the hardest thing to live with, but sometimes it's also our liberation." James didn't respond. Her words cut him like a knife. For him, the truth wasn't liberation. It was something that had to remain buried forever. With each passing day, their bond grew stronger. James began to realize that Sophie wasn't just someone who had entered his life during a difficult time. She had become the person who helped him free himself from his past, no matter how dark that process had been. At the same time, he understood their relationship was a risk, one he was willing to take. Standing on the edge between his past and his future, James felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time, a glimmer of hope. James Hunt stood by the window of his study, gazing out at the quiet street. Autumn leaves swirled gently in the air, filling the evening with an eerie calm. Months had passed since Emily's disappearance. The city had gradually forgotten about her, and the police had ceased their active search, finding neither trace nor clue. James knew his plan had worked flawlessly, yet an undercurrent of tension inside him refused to dissipate. His relationship with Sophie Miller had grown closer. She had become his refuge, the one person who truly seemed to understand what he had been through. But with this closeness came a creeping sense of danger. With every visit, every conversation, James felt as though invisible walls were closing in on him. Sophie, with her quiet persistence and ability to see what others missed, seemed like someone capable of unraveling any mystery. That evening, Sophie arrived at his house unannounced. Her knock at the door startled him, though he wasn't entirely surprised. She entered confidently, as always, but there was something different about her. Her gaze held a hidden intensity that James couldn't ignore. She brought a bottle of red wine and suggested they spend the evening talking. James agreed, doing his best to mask his unease. They sat in the softly lit living room, illuminated only by the warm glow of a table lamp. The conversation began light, revolving around her recent cases, local news, and plans for the near future. Yet, with each passing word, James sensed Sophie steering the discussion toward something she was preparing to say. After the second glass of wine, she set her glass down and looked directly into his eyes. "James, you know I've always been committed to uncovering the truth," she began, her voice calm but edged with steel. "And I think it's time we talk about Emily." James felt a chill sweep through him. He placed his glass on the table, trying to maintain his composure. "What do you mean?" he asked evenly, though a storm was already brewing inside him. Sophie leaned forward, her face serious, almost severe. "I know you wanted to get rid of her. I've seen it in you from the beginning. But here's what's interesting. I can't prove your involvement. You're too careful to leave evidence. But the truth is, I'm not going to expose you." James froze. Her words felt like an accusation, yet they carried no threat. He tried to discern her intentions, but her expression remained unreadable. Sophie continued, "You did what you thought was right. But I want you to understand this. Secrets always surface. Not today, not tomorrow, but one day, the truth will catch up to both of us. You need to be ready for that." James said nothing. His thoughts were chaotic, but he understood that her words were more than a warning. They were an attempt to strike a balance between their growing relationship and her professional ethics. She knew he was guilty, but had chosen to leave it between them. That evening their conversation shifted to other topics, but the tension lingered in the air. James felt that his life was no longer just about hiding the truth, but also a delicate dance with someone who knew too much. Yet, in this strange mix of fear and trust, he found something new, something that reminded him of life before Emily. Weeks passed. James and Sophie began spending more time together, traveling beyond Savannah and avoiding familiar places. Their relationship evolved into what could be described as the beginning of a new life. But James never forgot her words. Secrets always surface. One evening, as they sat on his porch with glasses of wine, Sophie said, "You know, we could start over, but that would require honesty." She paused, waiting for his response. James looked at her, then turned toward the horizon, where the sunset painted the sky in deep shades of orange and crimson. He knew that honesty, in her sense of the word, was impossible. His secret was too deep, too dangerous to reveal. But he resolved to take a step forward, promising himself that he would never again let the past define his future. The story of James Hunt and Sophie Miller ended as it had begun, shrouded in the shadow of a secret that would always linger between them. Yet in that shadow, James found a strange comfort, the knowledge that the only person who knew the truth was also the only one willing to accept it.